You're standing in a controlled zone with no visible credential, sir, and I'm going to need you off the scene before I write this up." The old man doesn't argue when he's ordered off the ramp. He checks his watch, as though the tower owes him something on a schedule only he knows. Lieutenant Nolan Pennington is 29 years old and has been flight line safety officer at Cutbank Field for 2 years, which is long enough to have a laminated card clipped to his belt loop with the subsection numbers already memorized, and short enough that he still recites them aloud, the way a man reads directions he trusts more than his own eyes. He has full current clearance, a radio that reaches every corner of the ramp, and a stance he has practiced in front of nothing in particular. The man in front of him has none of that. 81 years old, by the almanac of his own face. Coveralls the color of rained-on concrete, a freight lines patch stitched over the breast pocket where a name used to be, the name long since worn to thread. No badge, no escort, no paperwork in his hands, though there is a bulge in his coverall pocket that might be a wallet and is not. Subsection 4-12, Pennington says, "Unauthorized personnel on active movement surfaces. I'll walk you to the gate myself if I have to." Ground crew nearby have gone still in the particular way men go still when they sense a show and don't want to miss the opening line. Somewhere above them, in the glass box of the tower, a 23-year-old airman with 11 months on the console is watching this exact patch of tarmac the way she watches weather fronts, with the specific unease of someone who has learned that some things arrive quietly and change everything once they do. The old man does not move yet. He looks past Pennington's shoulder at the windsock, then down at the seam in the concrete beneath his own boots. A hairline crack repaired so many times it has become less a flaw than a feature, and he says nothing, which is its own kind of answer. Even Pennington doesn't clock as one. Within the hour, before this ramp closes for the evening shift, the tower will speak a single word over an open channel that outranks every subsection on that laminated card, every clearance level Pennington has ever held, and every assumption every person on this field is currently making about who exactly they are looking at. Nobody standing here yet knows that word exists. If you've ever watched someone dismiss a quiet man standing exactly where he meant to stand, you already know how this goes. "Sir," Pennington says again, softer now that the crew is watching, performing patience for an audience that has already decided this is funny. "I'm going to need you to start walking." The old man checks his watch a second time. It isn't digital. It has a face and hands, and he reads it the way a man reads a gauge he built himself, and then, only then, he starts walking, in no particular hurry, toward the gate, while somewhere behind that hairline seam in the concrete, the wind begins to shift very slightly out of the northwest. Weldon Ogle's right shoulder has not risen past chest height in 11 years, not since a rotator gave out hauling a feed sack he had no business lifting alone, and the field around Cutbank has learned, without ever discussing it, to wait when he needs to point at something, because he will turn his whole body to do it rather than lift that arm. It gives him a particular economy of motion, a way of facing a thing fully instead of gesturing at it from an angle, and there is something in that which reads, to anyone who bothers to actually look, less like frailty and more like a habit built by a man who spent decades making sure he was pointed at exactly one thing at a time. He wears the same coveralls most days of the working season, concrete gray, softened at the knees, the ghost patch of a freight line that folded before Pennington was born, still stitched crooked over his heart. In the left breast pocket, worn nearly through at one corner, rides a slide rule no longer sold anywhere on this earth. A slim brass-windowed strip he marked himself decades back, filing the increments down by hand until they matched, to the width of a fingernail, the particular crosswind that runs across this one field and no other. The window has fogged with age. He has never replaced it. He checks it the way another man checks his pulse, which is to say rarely, and only when something feels off. He comes to the same seam of tarmac every time the wind runs a certain way out of the northwest, and he does not come for the view. He stands with his weight settled slightly back on his heels, watch raised, and holds it there for a count only he keeps, comparing something in his head against the second-hand slow crawl, and then he lowers his arm and simply waits, the way a man waits at a mailbox for a letter he has stopped expecting but never quite stopped watching for. From the tower window, Airman Simone Nolan has clocked him 5 times in 11 months. She has not told anyone. It isn't a secret exactly. Nothing about it feels illicit, but there is no box on any form for elderly man times the wind on a seam of pavement and then leaves. And she has learned already, in less than a year on this console, that the things without a box on the form are usually the things worth writing down somewhere else. She keeps a small spiral notebook in the drawer beneath the radar repeater, and in it, in a hand still finding its adult shape, she has recorded the date, the wind heading, and the length of his stay for each of those 5 visits. 14 minutes. 9. 22. The day it rained sideways and he stood there anyway. She has never asked him his name. She has watched him check that watch the way a navigator checks a chart against a coastline he already knows by heart, confirming rather than discovering, and something about the confidence of that unhurried gesture has kept her from ever mentioning it to Pennington, who she suspects would file it as loitering and be done with it. Today, the wind is running exactly the way it runs on the days he comes. She marks it in the notebook before Pennington has even crossed the ramp toward him, northwest, 11 knots, gusting to 16. She adds, beneath the numbers, a note she has never written before, because something about today feels less like observation and more like an ending she can sense coming without being able to name it. He checked the watch twice. 20 minutes earlier, before the old man in the coveralls had drawn Pennington's attention at all, a fuel truck had rolled onto the apron for a scheduled top-off of a regional charter, and it was Pennington, not the crew chief, not the automated log, not anyone with more seniority, who noticed the truck's rear tire sitting low on one side by a margin most eyes would have called cosmetic. He'd walked the truck himself, boot to the sidewall, and found the pressure 11 pounds under spec, undocumented on that morning's inspection sheet. He waved it off the ramp without raising his voice, rerouted the fueling to a second truck, and had the discrepancy written up and flagged to maintenance inside 4 minutes, calm and exact, the kind of catch that never makes anyone's afternoon interesting, because it prevents the afternoon from becoming interesting at all. It was, in its unglamorous way, exactly the job done exactly right. And for those 4 minutes, Nolan up in the tower had watched him work with something like respect. That respect does not survive his walk back across the ramp toward the old man still standing at the seam. "You again," Pennington says, and there is a looseness in it now. An audience voice because 2 of the ground crew have wandered close enough to listen, and he has decided, without quite admitting it to himself, that this is a story he'll enjoy telling later. "Sir, per the card, I already asked you once." The old man does not answer right away. He looks at the windsock, considers it the way a man considers a note passed to him in a language he happens to still read fluently, and says, "Wind's backing. You'll want the numbers redone on runway 17 before that regional comes back down." It is delivered flat, without performance, 4 words shorter than anything Pennington has said to him yet, and it lands on the ramp like a dropped tool nobody picks up. One of the ground crew laughs. Not cruelly, just the reflexive laugh of a man watching a stranger say something that sounds like nonsense dressed as authority, and Pennington's mouth crooks in the shape of a man being patient with someone who doesn't know what a runway is for. "I've got the numbers, sir. I've got automated feed off the AWOS every 60 seconds. Subsection 4-12 is still in effect. I need you at the gate." Weldon looks at him a moment longer, unhurried, the way he looks at the seam before he starts his count, and then he simply turns his whole body toward the gate. No shrug, no lifted arm, no argument, and begins walking, leaving the correction sitting there unclaimed on the tarmac behind him, true and ignored in equal measure. He does not, in fact, leave. The gate lets out onto a gravel apron and a chain-link fence that runs the field's southern boundary, and Weldon Ogle stops there instead of continuing to whatever vehicle brought him, and stands with both hands loose at his sides, watching the flag on its pole snap and settle, and watching the windsock breathe with it. He reads them both the unhurried way a man reads a letter he's already memorized, checking only that nothing in it has changed. Behind him, a ground crewman mutters something to another about the old man and his weather report, and the second laughs, and neither of them notices that the flag has, in fact, begun to back exactly the 2 or 3 degrees Weldon predicted it would. In the tower, Simone Nolan watches all of this with the specific discomfort of someone who has just heard a private theory spoken aloud by a stranger and confirmed by the sky itself. She has clearance to pull historical ramp logs for training purposes, a privilege she's used exactly twice in 11 months, both times to settle an argument about a fuel spill nobody wanted to own. She pulls up the archive now less out of duty than a kind of itch, keys in the coordinates for the seam where the old man always stands, and scrolls back through decades of entries that get thinner and more clerical the further they recede, until the log format itself changes. Typewritten scans replacing digital rows, and there, logged against that exact seam on a date so old the year looks like a typo, she finds a call sign she does not recognize and has never heard spoken on this field in her 11 months of listening to every channel it carries. She sits with it a moment. It isn't in the current roster. It isn't in the retired designation index she was trained to check for ceremonial flyovers. It simply exists, alone, unexplained, tied to a patch of concrete. An old man in freight coveralls has now visited 5 times that she's personally logged, and probably dozens more that she hasn't. Below, on the open channel, Pennington is narrating the old man's continued presence at the fence to nobody in particular, the way men narrate things they find both irritating and mildly funny. "He's just standing there," he says, half a laugh in it, "reading the windsock like it's scripture." It is, Nolan will tell herself later, not really a decision so much as a reflex, the kind of thing you'd do to make a joke land, the way you'd toss a name into a conversation to see who turns around. She keys the mic, more amused than solemn, mostly aiming to rattle Pennington rather than to change anything at all, and reads the old call sign off the archived log exactly as it's typed into the open channel for the whole ramp to hear. The system does not treat it as a joke. 6 seconds after Nolan reads the old call sign into the open channel, the tower's status board, the same board that tracks every aircraft and every credentialed body currently on or above Cutbank Field, populates a new line without anyone touching a keyboard, and the line reads, in the same clean government typeface as everything else on that board, a status of active. Nobody laughs. The laugh that had been building in the room, half-formed and aimed at Pennington, simply stops, the way a held note stops when the hand lifts off the string. Pennington, still standing on the ramp with his radio in hand, watches the ground crew nearest him go quiet in 3 separate ways that have nothing to do with each other. One of them takes his cap off and turns it over in his hands without appearing to know he's doing it. One goes very pale and starts double-checking the fuel truck's paperwork he'd already checked twice. The third simply stares at the fence line where the old man still stands, as though expecting the concrete itself to explain something. "That's not," Pennington starts, and stops, because his laminated card, turned over twice in his fingers now out of pure reflex, has no subsection for a man who is, according to the system that governs every square foot of this field, still on active flight status. Trespass, loitering, unauthorized personnel, those have numbers. This does not. Nolan, up in the tower, is staring at her own console with the specific horror of someone who lit a match to see a room better and discovered the room was full of gas. She had meant it as a joke. The system did not receive it as one. Beneath the active line, a secondary flag has already populated, small and red, tagged to a name she does not recognize attached to the call sign, cross-referenced automatically against a historic clearance index she didn't know existed until this exact moment. A name that traces, 3 fields down, to an authorizing signature belonging to a then-lieutenant, now a name Nolan does recognize, because it currently sits on the letterhead of the airfield's own heritage board. The phone in the tower rings less than 4 minutes later. It is not local. The number that flashes is a base exchange 2 states away, and the voice on the other end identifies itself, crisp and immediate, as calling from the office of General Tobias Ainsworth, retired honorary chair of the Heritage Wing, requesting to know, with a controlled urgency that suggests this is not the first time this particular flag has ever gone up, only the first time in a very long while, why a historic clearance record tied to the general's own decades-old signature has just been automatically reactivated on a field 400 miles from where the general currently sits grounded by weather. Nolan answers honestly, because she doesn't yet know how not to. "An airman read an old call sign into the system," she says. "It came back active." There is a silence on the line that outlasts anything that's happened on this ramp all day. "Whose call sign?" the aide asks, though something in the careful way he asks it suggests he may already suspect the answer. "Was it?" Down on the tarmac, Weldon Ogle has not moved from the fence line. He has simply lowered his watch arm, slowly, and turned his whole body toward the tower window, the way he turns toward anything he means to face fully, as if he heard the question asked 400 miles away and is waiting, with the patience of a man who has waited a great deal longer than this for someone down here to catch up. The audit begins the next morning, and it does not begin with Weldon. It begins with a records officer from the Regional Aviation Authority arriving in a government sedan with a case of files thinner than the situation warrants, tasked with reconciling a historic clearance flag against current land use. A bureaucratic reflex, mandatory whenever an old military designation resurfaces on civilian-managed ground, meant to confirm nothing more than that no one is standing on a runway they have no right to stand on. It is meant to take an afternoon. It does not take an afternoon because the moment the officer pulls the hangar's chain of title to confirm the field's current boundaries, she finds a gap in the record 11 years wide, precisely where a required historic use review should sit and does not. The hangar, the old weather reconnaissance structure at the field's western edge, its corrugated flank rusted the color of a dropped penny, its dedication plaque long since pried off and lost, was reclassified as surplus property 11 years ago. The paperwork exists. What does not exist is the historic use review that should have preceded it, a review required by federal statute whenever a structure tied to a decommissioned classified program changes hands, a review that would have forced someone, at the time, to ask what exactly that hangar had once been used for and by whom. Nobody asked. The reclassification went through clean, and the hangar has sat ever since under a designation that makes it, on paper, disposable. Councilman Garrett Havermeyer hears about the audit before the field's own director does because his nephew, Lieutenant Nolan Pennington, calls him within the hour to ask, in a voice still working through what happened on the ramp yesterday, whether his uncle knows anything about why an old flight record would suddenly matter to a demolition vote 6 days out. Havermeyer does not answer the question directly. He asks instead, with the particular calm of a man recalculating a schedule in his head while still holding the phone to his ear, exactly how far along the audit has gotten and whether it has reached the reclassification paperwork yet. It has not fully. And Havermeyer, who has spent 11 years quietly steering the hangar's surplus status toward a private logistics buyer willing to pay 8 times its declared value once condemned and cleared, understands with total clarity that the only defense against paperwork catching up to him is paperwork moving faster than it can. The County Development Board's vote to finalize demolition and transfer, originally scheduled 6 days out, is moved by a procedural motion Havermeyer introduces himself and frames as a simple scheduling courtesy to a buyer eager to close to 3 days from now. Pennington does not yet know his uncle's stake in any of this. He knows only that he made a phone call meant to protect his family from an inconvenience, and that the inconvenience has, within a day, become a deadline aimed squarely at outrunning the truth. He stands at the edge of the ramp that evening, laminated card still clipped to his belt loop, and watches the hangar's long, rusted flank catch the last of the light. And for the first time since he pinned on this post, the card in his pocket feels like it is missing several subsections he did not know he'd need. The audit, in its second day, turns its attention to Weldon. It is not malicious. It is simply what audits do, follow the thread until it runs out, and the thread, once pulled, runs directly through decades of Weldon Ogle's presence at Cutbank Field that exists nowhere on paper except in the private spiral notebook of a junior airman who never told anyone she was keeping it. His clearance, granted under a classified designation 49 years ago, was never formally closed out upon his discharge 39 years past, an oversight so old it has calcified into something closer to fact than error. And the visits Nolan logged 5 in 11 months are only the tip of a record that, once the records officer starts asking ground crew how long the old man has been coming around, stretches back years further than anyone on the current staff can account for. On paper, it does not read as a devoted man returning to a place that mattered to him. It reads as decades of unauthorized access to a federal facility by a man with an unclosed classified clearance, and the same silence that protected the hangar's old purpose for half a century now threatens to make its last living witness look on the very forms meant to exonerate him like its oldest offender. The records officer says as much, gently but plainly, in a windowless room off the field's administration building, with Weldon seated across from her in his rained-on concrete coveralls, hands folded, saying nothing while she reads the numbers back to him. Nolan sits in the corner, her notebook in her lap now, opened, offered up as evidence, and finding that evidence of devotion and evidence of trespass can be, on a government form, the exact same words. It is General Ainsworth's voice, arriving by speakerphone from an airfield 2 states away where his own flight has been grounded by weather for 19 hours, that breaks the room open. Before anyone writes a single finding, the general says, and his voice, even flattened by a cheap conference speaker, carries the particular unhurried authority of a man who has given orders that mattered more than this one and lived to regret fewer of them. You should know whose signature is actually on the bottom of that original surplus request. It isn't Havermeyer's. It's mine. The room goes still in a way distinct from the tower's stillness the day before. Not shock, exactly, but the specific quiet of people recalculating who, in this story, is actually the wrongdoer. 49 years ago, Ainsworth explains, then a lieutenant flying missions under Weldon's ground control direction in a program nobody on base was told the purpose of, he had signed a temporary wartime surplus designation on the hangar himself, under orders, meant to last exactly as long as the classified program's operational window, and not 1 day longer. A designation meant to expire, quietly, the moment the program did. It never did expire. Nobody canceled it. And 11 years ago, when Havermeyer's development board went looking for a legal foothold to move the property, they did not forge anything. They simply found an old, never-rescinded wartime order sitting dormant in the file and treated the word surplus as though it had always meant what it now conveniently means. I signed the door that let him in, Ainsworth says, quieter now. I didn't know he'd still be standing in it. Nolan looks at Weldon, whose face has not changed through any of it, and understands with a small, cold clarity that the man who is about to save him is also, without ever having meant to, the reason any of this was ever possible at all. General Ainsworth arrives at Cutbank Field in person 11 hours before the board vote, having flown the last leg himself once the weather broke, and he does not go to the administration building or the records office or anywhere the audit has set up its thin case of files. He walks straight out onto the ramp past Pennington, who steps aside without being asked, and finds Weldon Ogle standing once more at the fence line, watch in hand, wind running gently out of the northwest. He does not salute. He does not say the word Pennington half expects him to say. He reaches instead into a bag slung over one shoulder and takes out a flight log, its cover soft with 49 years of handling, and sets it down on the low rail of the fence between them without a word. The way a man returns something he has been carrying so long, it has become indistinguishable from his own hand. Weldon looks at it. He does not pick it up right away. There's a night in there, Ainsworth says. October of that first year. 0 visibility, both radios half dead, and a lieutenant who had no business still being airborne. You talked me down blind by wind alone. Told me to trust the drift over the instruments because the instruments were lying and the wind wasn't. He pauses. I've never told anyone that's what happened. I told them I flew it myself. Weldon's hand finally moves to the log, opens it to a page marked with a corner folded so many times it has gone soft as cloth, and reads, in Ainsworth's younger handwriting, a landing time that matches to the minute, a memory he has never once needed to write down because he has never once been in danger of forgetting it. It is Nolan, standing a little apart with her notebook still in hand, who says the thing that turns the room. She has spent the last 2 days doing what nobody asked her to do, running the field's oldest paper archive against Weldon's clearance file, and what she has found sits now in her hands with the specific weight of something she does not entirely know how to hand over gently. Mr. Ogle, she says, your clearance renewal. It was filed every year for the first 16 years after your discharge under your own signature. Then it stops being your handwriting. She turns the folder so he can see it without her having to explain further. For the 11 years after that, it's renewed every single year in someone else's hand. It stops the same year the county reclassifies the hangar. The same year, near as I can tell, that a Bernice Ogle passed. Weldon takes the folder from her with the same unhurried care he took the flight log and turns each renewal page slowly, and there, in the margin of every one, in a hand grown a little less steady each year, but never once late, is his late wife's handwriting, quietly keeping a door open behind him that he never once asked her to guard. He filed the wind the way she filed her recipes, once, by hand, so it would still be true after he forgot why it mattered. He is quiet a long moment, the wind moving the flag above them, and when he speaks, it is not to explain the grief, which he does not name, but to finish the other thing the room has been circling for 2 days. That hanger wasn't ever surplus, he says, plain. No more than 3 sentences the whole time, the way he has always answered anything that mattered. It ran weather reconnaissance for a squadron nobody on this base was told the name of for 23 years, off my numbers, filed by hand from a shack that isn't standing anymore. Every man who came home in bad weather came home because of what that building was, not because of what somebody decided to call it on a form 11 years ago. Nobody in the room asks him to say more, and he doesn't, and General Ainsworth closes his own flight log gently, the way a man closes something he has finally set down for good. The board vote convenes on schedule, 3 days moved up from 6, in a municipal room with folding chairs and a county seal painted slightly off-center on the back wall, and it does not go the way Councilman Garrett Havermeyer spent 11 years arranging for it to go. General Ainsworth testifies first, plain and unhurried, laying the original wartime surplus order alongside the missing historic use review with the flat authority of a man who signed the first document and has spent 49 years not knowing what it would cost someone else. The restored review, compiled in 3 frantic days by a records officer who no longer sees this as an afternoon's paperwork, confirms what Weldon already said aloud in a windowless room. The hanger was never surplus, was never eligible for private sale, and the reclassification is voided on the spot, referred upward for a review of its own. Havermeyer says little in his own defense because there is little that holds. His arrangement with the buyer is referred to the county's ethics council before the meeting adjourns. It is Lieutenant Nolan Pennington who surprises the room. Called to account for how the audit began, he does not soften his own uncle's pressure on him in the 2 days prior, and says so plainly, in a voice that has lost the performance it carried on the ramp, that he was asked to help out run a review rather than pass one, and that he should have said no the first time he was asked instead of the second. It cost him at his family's table for a long while afterward. It does not cost him his post. Months later, a young airman fresh off training misfiles a clearance renewal on the very form that once nearly buried Weldon Ogle, and it is Pennington, laminated card long since retired to a drawer, who catches it before it leaves his desk and corrects it by hand, the plain, unhurried way, the way a man corrects a wind reading once someone has finally shown him how. The hangar is repainted that autumn, its corrugated flank restored to a clean government gray, a new dedication plaque bolted beside the door where the old one used to hang before it was lost to somebody's idea of progress. Weldon comes on the day of the small rededication, no ceremony beyond a folding table and a few names read aloud without embellishment, and he brings with him, from the pocket where it has ridden for decades, the hand-marked wind-drift slide rule, its brass window fogged, its increments filed to a tolerance no instrument at this field has ever matched. He sets it into a glass case bolted to the wall beside the plaque, closes the case himself, and steps back. Then he walks to the seam in the tarmac one last time, checks the wind with nothing but his own face turned into it, and does not raise the watch at all, because there is nothing left to time. A paving crew arrives the following week and lays a fresh coat over that stretch of ramp, and the hairline seam that held 49 years of a quiet man's patience disappears beneath it, smooth and unremarkable, indistinguishable now from any other foot of tarmac on the field. Weldon does not watch them do it. He is already walking toward the gate, unhurried, and he does not look back. Some records are only ever kept by the people who loved us enough to renew them without being asked.